Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining me. It's always a privilege and just a great opportunity to speak with industry leaders. So as Sarah said, my name is Kim Darple, and I lead the anti-fraud products at ACAMS. How many of you are familiar with ACAMS? Okay, so ACAMS is the Association of Anti-Money Laundering. So we certify banking professionals in anti-money laundering, and we also have an anti-fraud certification, crypto certification, and risk management certification, and we are partners with SAS. So what I'm bringing today is about 15 years experience in the anti-fraud space. So I spent some years at Synchrony Bank leading fraud from an operations, governance, and policy perspective. And then I did a stint at SAS as a product manager for the fraud solution. So how many fraud fighters are in the room? How many of you work in financial crimes? Okay, cool. Thank you for the work that you do every day. It's hard. So as I was thinking about my time at SAS, which was back in 2019, 2020, 2021, and looking at fraud, it looks very different today. And I see Gareth is here from SAS, so he can attest to that, and those of you who are working in the space. So that's what I'm here to talk about, sort of how fraud has evolved over time. And while my experiences are coming from the financial services industry, I think it applies across any industry, especially with advanced AI and what's happening in the space. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening, and then how, from an analyst perspective, or really anyone working in an anti-fraud role, how your roles are changing and how your training needs, learning needs, right, are also evolving, what that looks like. So here is some information that I found, right, that I thought was pretty relevant for this discussion to kick us off, and that is, as fraud scales through AI, the effectiveness of fraud defense depends on how well fraud analysts are trained and prepared to respond. So we can have all of the technology we need, we can have communities and networks, but people really need to be trained and understand fraud if we're going to be successful. And then Deloitte also had done some research and found that nearly half of financial services executives report challenges preventing fraud due to a skills training gap, even when controls and systems exist, right? So there is a whole ecosystem needed to prevent fraud, and certainly training and education is one of them. So let's talk about the numbers, right? I don't know about you, but I'm a stats person. So I will tell you that in 2025, the world, so if we think about the globe, lost $442 billion US dollars to scams. That's a lot. How many of you in here have been part of a scam or know someone who has? Probably most of you. 5% of adults worldwide encountered a scam in the past year. So we have seen scams just explode in the last couple of years. And we're going to talk about how AI is really propelling that, right, and is part of the cause for that. And then U.S. consumers lost $12.5 billion to fraud in 2024, and that was a 25% increase year over year. And so the funny thing about, or the interesting thing about that number is it's also projected or expected that not even half of people even report that they've been a fraud victim. So this number is very underrepresented. The EU, do we have anyone from Europe here in the room? Yeah, Gareth? Lost about $4.2 billion in just payment fraud. So if you work in financial services and work in fraud, you know that fraud gets categorized in many different ways. So this is just one of the ways in which fraud is happening. And then the UK, losses exceeded $2.3 billion in 2024. And the UK residents lost $11.4 billion to scams in the last 12 months. And then we have Australia's number, $2.3 billion lost in scams in 2024. So while I hate to say this, but in 2024, the globe lost $1 trillion to scams, $1 trillion. So we did a little better in 2025, but the reporting is early. So here just sort of sets the tone, right, for the conversation. And as we think about how prolific scams and fraud is impacting us as world citizens, the Economic Forum this year projected in their next 2 years that Misinformation and disinformation is one of their top concerns for the globe. And so this all plays into that. And I'm going to get into that in a minute. And then for the next 10 years, their top concern is the same thing: misinformation and disinformation and the adverse effects of AI and technology. So everyone in this room, right, we have a vested interest in learning more about this, understanding how it affects us, and understanding how we educate ourselves, our teams, and our organizations. So let's just dig in. So for my anti-fraud folks in the room, maybe this won't be new to you, but for everyone else, maybe it will be, and hopefully you'll have some questions. So how are criminals industrializing fraud? So that's kind of a new term that everyone should be familiar with, whether you work in banking or not, but industrialized fraud. And so basically what that means is, just like in the Industrial Revolution, machines came and helped, right, build an industry. The same is happening in fraud. So when we think about generative AI and now agentic AI and what it is doing to help criminals perpetrate scams and fraud is just really kind of mind-blowing. So the first thing I want to talk about is the AI-enhanced personalized attacks that are happening. And so I was having a conversation with some old peers here yesterday, and we were talking about how we used to be fearful for our parents, right, or elder abuse, people maybe who weren't in the know, and that they were easily scammed through phishing and vishing and smishing. So all that means is criminals reaching out to you through email, criminals reaching out to you through text messages, criminals reaching out to you in a variation of both, presenting to be someone else, right, but tricking you into believing that they are who they say they are and they need something from you. And so the conversation we were having is that has now shifted from, maybe, our parents, seniors, people who aren't as in the know, to AI has made these scams so good that even we fall victim to them. And we can be tricked, especially in today's environment where we're all moving so quickly, and you get a text message and it looks like it's from your bank, or you get an email, right? And it's building that urgency to respond. And so we can all fall victim, and so we always have to be on our toes. Because it used to be you could detect that an email was a scam because it had poor grammar or misspelled words or things didn't really make sense in what was being said, but that is no longer the case. Agentic AI and generative AI, well, really generative AI, have removed that barrier. And so now the scams are almost perfect. Next up, we have voice cloning and deep fakes. Raise your hand if you're familiar with these terms. Okay, yeah, it's like a sexy term, right? And a thing that you hear a lot about. So deep fakes are beginning to just be almost undetectable. It used to be you could ask someone to put their hand in front of their face, and if it was a deep fake, that couldn't happen. But that has now gone away. They've overcome that barrier with AI. So now you might be on a, whatever kind of video call with someone, and you won't know that they're not really there. So there was a case happened in Hong Kong. Some of you may have heard of this, where the guy was I believe he was a CFO on a Teams call where video was on, talking to his peers, and the CEO says, "We're doing this deal, and I need you to wire $4 or $5 million," and he did. And he sent an email the next day to say, "Hey, I took care of that." And the CEO says, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Right? So that just tells you, right? So imagine yourself on a Teams call or a video call, and you think you're talking to your peers, and you're not. That's how good this stuff is getting. And the same with voice cloning. So we have scams happening where people are being called by a scammer, but using the voice of a loved one to say, "I'm on the side of a bridge and I've had an accident and I need money wired to me for a tow truck," whatever it is, right? And it sounds like their loved one. And there's a sense of urgency to help that loved one. Or maybe it is your grandson's calling and he's in prison somewhere, right? Needs money. So we all just have to be more and more aware that these things, these tools that criminals are using, are becoming more and more advanced. And then we have our favorite, synthetic identity fraud. How many of you are familiar with synthetic identity fraud? Okay, so a good amount of you. So it used to be, when I was in my banking role back in the day, it was a very manual process to try to figure out if someone was synthetic. Then we had some technology come in, right, and help us to pretty easily figure out if someone was a synthetic. We'd look at things like, do they have a mortgage on their credit report? Are they only just credit cards that they were using? I mean, there were markers there. But over time, as always happens, the criminals figure out, right, how to outsmart. And so with these identities and with AI, they're now able to build these identities to where it's harder and harder to detect. And also they can hold on to things longer, right? So you may have built a synthetic identity 5 years ago, and they're still using it and building it, and so now it looks even more real. But again, the thing that's happening with, sort of this future look with agentic AI is, we talk a lot about rules and models and detecting fraud. Well, now it's going to become sort of machine against machine. And so these agentic models that criminals are using, they're going to learn from what fails. Right? So if I'm a bank and I decline your transaction or I decline your application for synthetic markers, it's going to feed back to these criminal models, right? And then they're just going to go build the next thing to answer to that. And so it is imperative, right, for any bank, really any organization who has identity, right, of a consumer that they're trying to vet, to have the right technology in place and people who know how to use that technology and know the markers and what they're looking for. So AI probing and evasion tactics, I've kind of touched this already. So, fraudsters using AI to test and evade bank controls, right? So just instead of an onboarding situation, you're in a transaction situation. So when you're using your credit card, your debit card, you're sending a wire, or you're doing a push payment, all of those rules that sit behind to detect red flags in those transactions and decline, criminals can now use their own AI to figure out, oh, I was declined at a $10,000 level, let me try an $8,000 level and get through. So this is what the financial services industry is up against, and it's daunting, right? I'm always just in awe of people who still sit in the fraud seat today. So we talk a lot about, controls as a defense, technology as a defense, but now we need to talk about our analyst as a defense, and really continue building a continuous kind of roadmap for strategic, training and education. So let's talk about the challenges to fraud analysts. So how many of you have ever been a fraud analyst, sitting on the front line, looking at alerts all day, trying to figure out, is this fraud, is this not fraud? And so when you think about all the things we've just talked about and all the things you've already seen at SAS today, or yesterday and today, and the advancements in FRAML. So for those of you who don't know, so FRAML is sort of AML and fraud coming together. We have to start to think about what is that analyst now faced with and how are skill sets changing over time. So we are in the AI arms race. So, because criminals are using the advanced AI to nearly perfect fraud schemes. So how will analysts be able to detect that? What do they have, right, to help equip them to make the best decisions? And then we talk about the limitations of automated defense. So as fraud becomes more sophisticated, analysts will need to be equipped with the latest information in order to execute, their precise judgment. And so that means having a deep kind of domain expertise about fraud. So what are the markers of a push payment fraud tied to, gosh, could this be a scam? And what are the markers of scams? And so I'm getting this alert and I'm looking at it. What are other things I need to be looking at? What are some other markers? What are some other things, right, that's going to clue in your analyst about the decisions that they need to be making? And then, let's face it, we have a landscape that's we call it trust, right? And trust has eroded. So no matter what you're doing, so if you think of yourself as a consumer, we say in fraud, like all of our information's been compromised. It's on the dark web. People are buying, criminals are buying it and they're using it and they're becoming you. And so as we get into this landscape or this kind of environment of compromised trust, it gets even harder for an analyst, right, to know, are you really you? I mean, at first we had OTP, right? That was like a big thing. Then we went to selfies, right, where you could try to think you knew someone by, hey, send me a picture of yourself. Well, we know deep fakes and cloning is now starting to infiltrate that. So it's like, what are analysts going to be able to use and have in order to feel good about knowing the decision that they make is right? And then we have human in the loop. So, with all the technology that does get used today, we still have to have humans looking at things. And so what we know is, at least those of you in banking who use technology, is that it's called the low-hanging fruit, right? So AI is going to come in and take care of those low-risk alerts, right? Going in and making decisions. We saw some of that in this morning's Framel session. But what happens when those higher scoring alerts are coming in and your analysts are looking at those? Those are more complex. And so training for them and education more on a broader level and what they're looking at and the technology and how the technology is working is so important. And also that they're looking to make sure that the technology isn't having some kind of hallucination, as we call it, right? That they are sort of oversight as well for what they're seeing so that they can escalate when they need to. So there's just a lot of change, right, happening in the fraud analyst world. Just for comparison, it used to be you would just get the alert, you would look at that one account, make a decision based on some parameters, and move on. But today, right, we look more typically at a customer level. We're looking more at a holistic level, and then you're looking across sometimes your whole enterprise to see what commonalities and patterns that the data is showing so that decisions can be made and actions can be taken. So knowing all of these things, right, that we've talked about that an analyst is up against, it's like we've gone from sort of a static environment to more dynamic. And so that really puts pressure on analysts and their skill sets to be able to adapt and really level up. That's really what's happened in this space. I remember back in the day, we would hire fraud analysts. They would just come from customer service, right? And they just sort of were wanting to do something different, and all they had to do was be nice, or oftentimes not be nice because everybody treated everybody like they were criminals, right? So we've come a long way, right? And so as we look at the future, and even in the last financial services session I sat in on, we were talking about quantum computing, right? So it's like, what do all of these things mean for a skill set for a fraud analyst in the future? Because what they're going to have to do is have a very good comfort level with fraud and data analytics, right? Whereas 5 years ago, a fraud analyst didn't have to think about data analytics, but today we do. Because there's an imperative there to understand what's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening. Investigation. So, we have these great and wonderful tools today that bring in link analysis, horizon scanning, all the things that analysts are using. And it's how do we train them to use those in an investigative way that you really, right, are getting the most out of that investigation. Because we know that with fraud, time is everything. We have to be in real-time mode all the time. So for those of you sitting in a fraud seat, you get that, right? There's like an urgency to know what's going on and to be able to respond. And so good investigation is critical to that. And then we have critical questioning. So knowing at what point, what is the trigger point that you're going to ask a question, that you're going to look at something and say, that's off, right? But again, it's having a good foundation of learning and understanding and continuing that so that you know what's happening, not just today, but what are you expecting to happen in the future, and having the ability to question things critically in a fraud environment is so important. And then fraud risk management. So again, I think prior days, old days, that fraud analyst was just looking at one thing and moving on. Today, with the regulatory environment, I would say, as I put it up here, managing risk is everyone's job. And understanding controls, right? Understanding from a customer perspective, there's so much, pressure on all of us to prevent fraud, but not impact a customer's experience, right? Or we call it customer friction. And so having good fraud risk management practices in place is critical. And it's not just it's not just like the second line of defense's job or some people in first line of defense. It's really everyone and everybody understanding the role they play in managing fraud risk. So I know for me, over time, right, and seeing evolution, we've kind of gone from fraud was a little team that sat over in the corner, right? And they were looking at alerts and looking at some suspicious things. And fraud was just the cost of doing business. To today, right, we're starting to see more integration of AML, fraud, cyber, and we're seeing the losses mount, right? So if I go back to my first slide and we talk about the billions of dollars that are being lost, we have more executives coming to the table, right, to try to help figure out how we resolve and protect the business and the consumer and the reputation, right? There's a lot of reputational risk that comes nowadays with fraud. Now we have scams, right? So scams where the customer is complicit. The customer is giving the okay to do things, right? So more and more, the complexities of fraud are just continuing to elevate. And we as fraud professionals just have to continue to keep learning, keep networking, right? Keep talking to peers in the industry, like at events like this. No one can really rest on their laurels at all. So it's a constant pressure. So, I told you earlier, I've worked in banking, worked for SAS, worked in consulting as well for financial crimes. But in today's role, I'm really focused on education and certifications and thought leadership. And so that's what we do at ACAMS, right? So that's what we're bringing to the industry. We have thousands of webinars, white papers, conferences, certifications, trainings to make sure that everyone in the industry stays as up to date as possible. And I take that very seriously, by the way. So what I would like to challenge all of us to think about is a dynamic approach to learning and upskilling for yourself personally, for your teams directly, and for your organizations as a whole. Because again, everybody owns fraud mitigation, right, and understanding their role. I remember working at Synchrony in the fraud governance role and having to go talk to people in collections, and they couldn't understand why I was there talking to them. And I'm like, well, because your authentication practices don't protect the bank or the customer, right? So it was having that conversation. It was educating this leader, right, as to where these practices fall short and where they open us up to risk. It was me going and talking to marketing teams about campaigns they were running and sending to old addresses and what's the risk in that, right? So it's really you as anti-fraud professionals, or if you're not in the anti-fraud space getting curious about it, to start to reach out and have these conversations sort of across departments and understanding the bigger picture of what it means. But the dynamic approach to learning and upskilling is kind of what this has all been driving toward, right? First thing is continuing education. So hopefully all of you are out there, whether you're taking online certificate courses through whatever organization, whether you're going to university or college level courses to learn about AI and technology, because let's face it, it's the era that we're in, and we all have to be able to speak intelligently about AI and understand it. Because as you are going out and talking to SAS or whatever vendor you're talking to, right? You have to also be intelligent about what they are telling you. And does that fit in your organization? So for those of you, in leadership roles, technology roles, really understanding the fundamentals and basics. And then, of course, online certifications, getting a credential helps you, right, to propel your career and achieve other goals that you have within your organization and even outside. Embedded learning, so taking on a department rotation, like maybe you're in the fraud organization today and you sit in, let's say, a governance role. Maybe you need to go do a rotation or a shadow in technology, in an AI kind of role, because that only helps you from a governance perspective be better able and equipped to govern. And the same for fraud analysts, right? To understand that there isn't a black box, there's transparency, and here are things in there where you can share them. I know fraud can be a little, we like to keep some things under wraps, and that's fine, but I think the fundamentals behind it are really important from a department rotation or a shadowing. Webinars and publications. I read a lot. I know ACAMS has webinars, but I also go to other vendors' webinars on technology because I feel like it's my responsibility to make sure that our trainings and certifications are as up to date as possible. But we all have to own doing that, right? And carving time out of a very busy day to stay updated is so important. Participating in industry panels. So if you have been on a stage this week or will be, or you have been in the past, there's a lot of prep that goes into that to go tackle a topic and really know it and be able to present it to peers and colleagues and other people in the industry. Mentoring, just a quick show if you're not too shy, but how many of you have a mentor? So important, right? And I think sometimes the further we go in our career, we may not tap into that. We may want to be a mentor, but I think it's always important to have mentors. And some can be more for, professional development, but certainly tag someone in your AI or technology groups and say, hey, can you mentor me? I need a quick study on XYZ. And just to be able to reach out and bounce ideas off of concepts, what's the latest thing, right? So I think for me, going back with quantum computing, right? That is my thing to now go try to understand more. I know most, at least banks, and I'm not sure about other industries, maybe insurance. There are formal working groups, subcommittees that meet and make decisions in a governance perspective. If you can join those, observe those, read the notes from those, always very insightful and some good, information in those meetings, just how they're operating, how they're working, what are the topics, right, that your organization is faced with. Again, some of it may be sensitive, but some of it you may be able to get in and look at and observe. Build a strong industry network. I think everyone in the room here would agree. I think that's part of why we come to these types of events. And hopefully you have people outside of your organization, especially in the fraud realm or AML, that you can reach out to and say, hey, we're seeing this, and our organization, are you seeing the same? It's just always good to have a network. So I encourage that. And then just hands-on learning. And I think sometimes this can be the hardest because this is where we feel like we get a little maybe embarrassed, right? So I have to show up and participate in a tabletop exercise, and gosh, it might really show that I have some deficiencies. But I will tell you, you would rather find out in a tabletop exercise than a real live event. So I've gone through some of those from a anti-fraud perspective, and it can get really uncomfortable. Has anyone in here ever participated in a tabletop exercise? Yeah, it can be really intimidating. You're thrown into a real world example and you have to go figure out what are you going to do. And so I think this is some of the best learning that can happen in within groups. Participate in case deep dives and root cause analysis. So especially in fraud, regardless of the industry, if you've had a fraud event, it is really important to be able to deep dive into that event to understand what happened, where were the points of failure, was it a control, was it technology, was it a person, like what happened? And there's great learning in that, right? So that you can go back and look at your current policies and procedures and know what you need to update, know what training gaps you might have. And it's good to, I think sometimes we think only the leaders in the organization get to do that, but you should bring in fraud analysts into those discussions when you can, and other like frontline leaders, because there's great learning in those. And then job shadow. So it's a little bit like department rotation, but a little different, from the aspect that you might just go for a couple of hours, right, and just look at what someone's doing. I remember it was kind of a funny story, but when I first started at SAS, I had come from banking. I really didn't know anything about software. I was hired for my fraud expertise. And I went to a developer and I said, hey, can I job shadow you? Can I watch what you're doing? And he laughed. He said, of course, but I'm just like writing code. It won't mean anything to you. But, at least I got to sit and watch what was happening. And he was right. I didn't learn a thing other than I felt really not smart in that area. But, there were learnings that happened across the aisle because I had a whiteboard in my office and I said, hey, I want you to come in every day and write some like technology terms that I don't know, the terminology that you use. And I will start to use your terminology. So I did learn a lot of speak at SAS. So it was great experience for me. So this is what I bring to you today. So just some key takeaways, because we always like to have key takeaways. So I think we all know, right? We've been here for 2 days. AI is advancing. It's industrializing fraud. It's being used for really bad things, but it's also being used for really good things. But we all just have to know how to use them for good things and who to rely on to help us do that. Fraud analysts now require more dynamic skills. So I know we have fraud analysts here, but this is really anyone in an anti-fraud role. We all are being forced to up our game, or we are just going to lose everything. I mean, I don't mean to sound dramatic, but that's the scale that we're talking about. And again, while fraud operations, so your operations teams within your organizations are going to deploy AI to gain efficiencies, that's a thing we should embrace. But we also have to remember that then that low-hanging fruit and the things that we're gaining efficiency from is going to put more pressure and more expectation on the folks left in their roles, right? So their skills are going to have to become more dynamic. So as we talk about FRAML, like an AML and a fraud coming together, you have to have specialists who can look at both and know what's going on, right? So again, we're sort of upping the game. And then, pressure abounds. We all have to keep up with a lot of things in a fraud role. So as I was saying earlier, preventing fraud, don't lose sales from good customers, right? That's the other part of that. And still protect the organization and its reputation. So there's so much pressure. And so it's really, again, equipping everyone in the fraud organization to feel confident about what they're doing, so that they can do that. And then, just customized roadmaps for learning and education. So if you're in a leadership role today and you're looking at your teams, do you have a roadmap for them? Are you using just your own internally created fraud training? If you are, that's fine. But it's like, how do you know that there aren't any gaps there? What are you doing to benchmark the training that you're providing? When was the last time that training was updated? That is a conversation I have with fraud leaders a lot. And they'll say, I don't really know, right? So while a certification might be a one and done, we still have to be engaged in continuous learning and continuous updating of data and how things are happening. And then just expanding, right? So it's no longer just fraud typologies. It's no longer just risk controls. It's now, what is the horizon scanning? What is AI going to do to us? How are we prepared? And how are our agents prepared to respond? So these are all the things that I hope you take away from our conversation. I want to thank you, but before I end, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to ask any questions that the audience may have. And I always say, don't be shy. It makes me feel better if you have questions.
At this time.
Okay. Oh, good. He didn't leave me hanging.
Yeah, sure. So, question a little bit. So I know that you mentioned deepfakes. That's about like a fake live videos, but then like images are even more simplistic than that. So I'm curious. Like in the past, when I've gotten checks for like birthday or whatever, there's a relatively new feature where you take a picture of the check and like send it into your bank, and that's easier than having to go to the desk. Is AI getting to a place where banks are going to have to say, I'm sorry, we can't do that anymore. You're going to have to bring the check in because AI is getting so good?
It's a possibility. And I would say, so today, so if you just take a picture, right, and send it in for, let's say, authentication, today, most technology providers who are doing authentication will be able to check a lot of things on that, right? So let's say it's a selfie, right? You have to do. They can check for liveness. There's a lot of things that they're looking at to make sure that that's just a recent picture, and there's a whole bunch behind it. But with the advancements in AI, right, that could be skirted. So we're now looking to technology providers to give us even more insight on that photo or whatever's been submitted, right, that it's real. But if it can't be authenticated through technology, then yes, I think more banks are going to say, you need to come in, right, or some other way to verify that, A, you are who you say you are, B, you're a real person, right, not a synthetic identity. And, looking at all of those factors through technology, I think what we'll also see are passwords go away. How many of you have heard of this? Like we're going passwordless. Most of us work from our device, right? So everything really can be authenticated from your device, and there are technology providers who have all the insights on your device. I don't mean to scare everyone in the room, but they know a lot about you just from your device. So that's more of the future, I think, and where we're going, and getting away from selfies, pictures, as ways of authenticating. Just like we're getting away from OTP, right? Because we know OTP can be manipulated. There's man-in-the-middle schemes, all kinds of things, right? That, again, it was great when it was new, but it's criminals are figuring out how to get around it.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for your question.
Hi, I work for a credit union in New York, and one of the things we're starting to see a lot of is actually AI-generated pay stubs for conditions for loans. There was one, they're so convincing, and it's getting very, very difficult to actually tell them apart from an actual pay stub. One of the last ones we had, the only reason we found out it was a fake pay stub was the man was foolish enough to forward the email from the guy that he got the fake pay stubs from as part of the conditions. So basically the second half of the email is like, here's your fake pay stubs, bro, but other than that, just by looking at them, you could not tell that they were fake. What is AI doing to help detect other AI creations?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and thank you for the example. I've been doing some reading as of late that there are some technology providers who are getting better at detecting fake. So, because maybe they have, I'm just going to use ACAMS as an example. So it's like getting what an ACAMS pay stub might look like, right, and comparing it against like actual pay stubs as one way. So again, it goes back to technology. So I don't know if you're using technology today or if it's just a human eye looking at it. Just a human eye. Yeah, so you need technology because it can look at things like that, like bounce it up against what it knows, right, these pay stubs to look like, or the sizing of font, like all these things, right, that only technology can really look at. Because you're highlighting that a lot of times we use humans, right, to look at things. And because of AI, we can no longer detect it with the human eye. And we do need technology to help us. So happy to talk with you further about that, about some of the providers that I've looked at or read some of their stuff. Great, thank you for your question. It's a great question. And that, again, that just highlights. And good for your analysts for detecting and picking up that it had been forwarded.
Such laziness, right? You just one more step, save it, you know, and then attach it as a separate.
Yeah,
email.
I always say
Wow.
we fraud people and we don't believe anybody. Like when ACAMS reached out to me to help build this anti-fraud certification through email, I thought it was a scam. I was like, I'm not even responding to this, right? So, great. All right, well, you have been a great audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Kim.